Welcome, everyone, to Climate Dialogues, an event organized by the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics Prague, CETEP. My name is Eva von Redecker. I'm research team leader at CETEP and senior researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Climate Dialogues is an annual honorary lecture series, a signature event for CETEP. That brings two internationally distinguished scholars to Prague to discuss philosophy, politics, and ethics in light of climate crisis and propose new ways of thinking about our contemporary age. For this year's Climate Dialogues, we have a great pleasure of bringing together Wendy Brown and Eva von Redecker, who will discuss the concept of freedom in a time of ecological crisis, and will probe the possibilities of theorizing freedom anew, and in terms that would respond more aptly to our current ecological realities. The format for this evening is the following. Wendy Brown and Eva von Redecker will give a brief lecture, a position paper of sorts, and on how we can rethink freedom today. Then this will be followed by a conversation between the two thinkers, a dialogue, and then we will open the floor to questions and from the audience. So our first speaker is Wendy Brown, who is UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the US. Wendy Brown is an author of many books on political theory, in her recent work focusing especially on neoliberal rationality and its broader social and political consequences. Her most recent books include Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber, and In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Let's give Wendy Brown a warm welcome.
Appreciate it. I want to first begin by thanking Ivana and also her wonderful staff, the working people who facilitate visits like ours, without whom nothing, and then get on with it here. What I want to do today is talk in rather blunt ways about political freedom, its distinctive roots and demands, and what I'm still going to insist on calling the human condition. And I'll defend that in a moment. I want to, under that rubric, explain a little bit about why it's so hard for us to think about political freedom, and then explore what I will call the scene of human freedom in modernity, and why the inherited form of freedom that we have inherently damages both human and non-human life and makes us unfree. And then I'll very briefly consider how to reconstruct freedom that would bring it closer to the ground of the powers that humans generate, that would modestly enfranchise nature, that would allow us to practice rule in a more partial and open and yet effective way as an expression of political freedom, and that would place interdependency and regenesis rather than individualism and interest at freedom's heart. So let me begin with the problem. Speaking of political freedom today requires, I think, building a term and its importance, a term and its importance that have nearly vanished from our vocabularies, our sight, and our minds. Indeed, apart from the struggle for independence of a people or a nation that are under the control of another people or nation, that is, anti-colonial struggles, political freedom as an ongoing practice of freedom is very nearly an oxymoron. Within contemporary discourse, freedom tends to be framed almost exclusively as a matter of personal or familial or corporate liberty, and tends to be positioned in opposition to politics, to rule, to law, and to policing. That we have forgotten how to formulate political freedom, the distinctly human practice of sharing powers of rule together, I think is no surprise. Political freedom was so firmly excised by liberalism, with liberalism's focus on individual liberty as rights, rights against each other, rights against the state, and then so directly attacked by neoliberalism as a practice of tyranny or totalitarianism. That's the way that neoliberal rationality frames legislated political directions. It's so firmly excised by liberalism, so thoroughly attacked by neoliberalism, that it is not really even ghostly at this point. It's gone. So, what do I mean by political freedom? This is where I'm going to be blunt and simple, even for a philosophical audience. It's a very simple concept and an infinitely complex and variable practice. Political freedom I take to emanate from the fact that human beings generate a plethora of powers, more elaborate, more far-reaching, and more enduring than power understood as mere strength or intimidation, mere policing or dominance, whether individual or collective. This plethora of powers that humans generate, which I'll spend some time on this evening, tend to be invisible to the eye, but so potent that they make histories and humans and the planet itself. Political freedom, the core of democracy, pertains directly to these powers. It also pertains to yet another human power, namely the power of the people to act together to enact their idea of the good. The task of political freedom is to strive to bring the constellations of power that we generate under our control, and to do this together under conditions of political equality. This task, as I suggested, is complex, it's difficult, it varies in form, and above all, it's never finally achieved. It's always aspirational, and its temporalities are always open. That is, the object of political freedom isn't just satisfaction of a wish to be free. It's a project of handling powers in the present that were generated in the past, and to do so in order to set a specific course for the future. These temporalities, this fusion of past, present, and future in the very architecture of political freedom, is one reason that I consider it so important that we recover and reconstruct political freedom in the Anthropocene. I take it to be our best hope for taking responsibility for what humans have done, what we have unleashed, and what we can do differently. I want to insist, before moving more deeply into what I called freedom scene, this problem of human generation of power, that political freedom is not a matter of liberty's positive valence as opposed to its negative one. Indeed, Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction between positive and negative liberty, I think works against the project, or the prospect even, of revalorizing political freedom. That distinction between negative and positive liberty disappears the promise of democracy as self-rule. It replaces it with an analytic distinction between two kinds of individual liberty, one pertaining to the absence of impediment to acting, the other pertaining to the conditions enabling action. That is, I think, in Berlin's case, methodological individualism frames both negative and positive liberty. Positive liberty is about the liberty of the individual or a collection of them to enact what they want. That is, it stays within liberalism, resolutely rejecting Rousseau and not only Marx, in appreciating how a people can become and stay free through non-liberal transformations of the conditions of their existence. To the extent that the distinction between positive and negative liberty does move positive liberty into a political modality, which certainly Berlin acknowledges, it tends to identify positive liberty with a form of statist rule expressed in communist dictatorship. That is, Cold War discourse is the framework for the entire essay. In short, I take Berlin to vanquish democracy as a form and practice of freedom. For him, democracy itself is not freedom. It's only that which yields or protects freedom for individuals. And yet, Berlin's false path may help us appreciate why political freedom is so hard to value or even grasp today. Liberalism, I will suggest, and I think you'll hear a lot more about it from Eva, liberalism knows only one kind of freedom, individual, privately exercised for one's own good. And as Eva so brilliantly will expound, it focuses on potential obstacles that we face while moving about in the world. Obstacles from the state or other individuals are all cast as so many blockades against one's movement in space. I'm going to leave the development of that problem to Eva, but suggest there are other reasons that the very idea of political freedom tends to be confusing or incoherent to moderns. First, the problem of the splitting off of freedom from political power. In liberalism, power tends to be freedom's opposite, even its enemy. It is what threatens and constrains freedom. In fact, I'm going to insist on the opposite, namely that all freedom, but especially political freedom, is comprised only of its relationship to power, to share power rather than allow its monopolization by the few or the one, to direct power rather than to be directed by it. And of course, Marx's critique of liberalism, and especially rights, rests right here. But Foucault also grasped this. Foucault's formulation of freedom as a practice, rather than as a state or an achievement, also casts freedom as a constant grappling with, or against, powers that govern us if we do not seek to govern them ourselves. Now, at the same time that Marx helps illuminate this first problem, liberalism's tendency to split freedom from political power, to turn freedom into a project of escaping political power or being untouched by political power, at the same time Marx helps illuminate this problem, there's also a neglect of the political in the Marxist tradition that I think further disorients us about political freedom. This neglect of the political in Marxism arose from the conviction that emancipation, freedom understood as emancipation, is a social, not a political matter. It also arises from the Marxist equation of the political with the state, and the belief that the state in turn consisted mainly of our alienated social powers. There's another reason we have a hard time understanding political freedom, and this has to do with the relationship between states and rights. If states are the imagined source and protector of rights, this has a tendency to lead us to see rights themselves, as expressions of political freedom. In fact, I want to suggest rights are the opposite. They secure personal or individual liberty that does not challenge, but tends to consecrate the very powers that necessitate rights. And apart from voting rights, which do minimally ensure the political equality that is democracy's prerequisite, rights have little to do with the activity of ruling ourselves in common. As Marx points out, rights separate us from one another. They confirm us as egoistic individuals, as interest-bound, and as antagonistic in relation to other rights-bearing creatures and to the state itself. In sum, when we speak of political freedom as democracy's raison d'etre, its highest expression, we are speaking of something that has largely vanished with modernity, and therefore must be brought alive again to realize democracy, and particularly the kind of democracy that I think yields any hope of our taking up a different position in relationship to non-human life or the rest of the planet. In sum, what I'm saying is that when we speak of political freedom as democracy's raison d'etre, we're actually speaking of the evacuated ground that liberalism and Marxism produced in, for, and as democracy. Okay, now let me turn a little more directly to what I've described very briefly as the scene of human freedom and suggest what I mean by this. Human freedom arises out of a peculiarly human problematic, One could even call it a peculiarly human need that arises from our special species practices. Or as Marx put it in the German ideology, it arises not from philosophical speculations about what we are as human beings, but rather from what we do as a species. So what is it that we do? What's so peculiarly human about our doing? There are 4 elements to this, of what I'm calling the scene of human freedom. First, we alone among the creatures generate, inherit, and inhabit orders of power that condition almost everything about our lives. These orders, as I already suggested, are often invisible, they're inevitably complex, and they traverse psychic, social, economic, cultural, and political domains of existence. Such are the powers entailed, for example, in modes of production, consumption, extraction, in finance and technology, in culture and religion, and in the stratification and subject constitution at the site of race, gender, sexuality, caste, and ethnicity. Neither natural nor divine, these constellations of power emanate from humans. They don't arrive from the gods. They don't emerge from nature. Yet they exceed human powers as they generate hierarchies, exclusions, subjectivities, potentials, conduct, and also suffering. The more sophisticated, the more globally integrated, the more ubiquitous, the more extensive these powers are, the greater freedom's challenges. So this first point, we generate constellations of power that are larger than our intentions, larger than ourselves, cooperatively produced. This is Marx 101, but it's necessarily expanded beyond modes of production, even as it hews to Marx's basic point that historically generated social powers take on a life of their own in human existence and condition nearly everything about the present. Second dimension of this problematic. We alone among the creatures are potentially dominated by these enormous powers, these enormous orders of power of our own making. Historical powers not only condition and constrain and animate the present, they also dominate us to the degree that they have slipped our grasp, that we do not control them. This form of domination is more significant than organized physical strength or command or rule or interdiction or even control of resources. Now to Marx, I've added Weber, supplemented the point by the Frankfurt School. The second point then, not only do we generate these enormous orders of power, they also potentially dominate us to the extent that we do not bring them under our own control. Third point. These powers, even as they change over time and are replaced by new forms, often leave traces or damages or residuals that themselves become agentic. This is the story, of course, of the Anthropocene, in which the intensive use of fossil fuels to power European capitalist modernity has forever changed the course of planetary history and becomes an agent in that history. That is, from climate change to climate migration, to the depletion of water tables and extinction chains, all these things are now agents in history, but were, of course, unleashed by the powers of what Andreas Volkers calls fossil modernity. But in addition to the story of the Anthropocene, this is also the story of colonialism, in which the carving of the globe and the political economies of the imperial Euro-Atlantic order don't simply come to an end with the formal independence of colonies. Rather, the agencies unleashed by the effects of these histories become part of what makes present and future. So here, to Marx and Weber and the Frankfurt School, I'm adding the thinking of Latour, Chakrabarty, and others. The point is, production does not just make history, but generates future conditions through its effects and residuals and future agents beyond the human. Fourth and finally, we alone among the species struggle to craft and govern ourselves individually and together amidst these orders of power. We alone develop a specific political capacity that's aimed at supporting or containing or steering or overcoming the powers into which we are born, the historical powers that condition our present. We do this through states and other institutions, through laws, through leadership, through popular power and struggles. We are the species, in other words, that develops specifically political power and political rule to deal with our inherited world of powers and potentially to remake the world according to specific values organized by and animated and enacted by that political effort. These values might be justice and regeneration. They might be injustice and destruction. So here, what I'm drawing on to add to my collection of thinkers about political freedom and the Anthropocene is a bunch of non-liberal theories of the importance of the political, from the Greeks, Aristotle, etc., through Machiavelli and Rousseau, through radical democratic, Republican, and even Schmittian theorists today. Theorists who think about the political as a specifically human domain of attempting to bring our life under our control. Okay, so it's this combination that constitutes freedom's distinctive scene for Homo sapiens. That is, our inadvertent yet cooperative generation of orders of power organizing the present and having enduring effects and producing new agencies in the present and future. Our conditioning and our potential domination by these powers to the extent that we lose control of them, and our attempt to contain or steer or transform them through politics. It's this combination that I take makes political freedom such a difficult yet necessary project for humans. Freedom conceived as an individual holding, exercised as choice, elides these multiple powers by which we're shaped and burdened and constrained, and it elides our capacity to attempt to rule them. This elision is what makes modern liberal and especially neoliberal formulations of freedom fundamentally a desertion rather than the culmination of a long historical wrestle with freedom's meaning and possibility. Now, philosophers over the century, of course, have located human freedom in other aspects of the human condition. They've located freedom in the question of how to master our appetites or bodily needs, in reason or moral deliberation, in action based on will, animated by judgment, in choosing our values or identity or life purposes, in autonomy from others or from the state, in rights to conscience, to speech, to assembly, in sovereignty, and of course, in security of property. Apart from ignoring the distinctive scene of freedom that I've just mentioned, each of those also inevitably distinguishes those eligible for freedom by virtue of having one or more of these traits or capacities from those imagined not to have these capacities by virtue of being consigned or identified with the body or labor or the household or emotion or illiteracy or poverty or tribal belonging or rule by myth. That is, when freedom is not figured in relation to our peculiar human powers, but only figured in relation to our imagined special human attributes, it's inevitably conferred only on the human said to have those attributes. Hence, Greeks versus barbarian, propertied versus worker, man versus woman, European versus African, and today I would argue Israeli versus Palestinian. Inevitably, freedom that is drawn from these imagined universal attributes of humans also end up denigrating the non-human. It embeds freedom within a humanist supremacism. Our special capacity for reason, for will, for morality legitimates our instrumentalism toward life imagined as lacking these things. Thus does freedom in the Western humanist frame, and I would argue pre-modern as well as modern, liberal and Republican, invert into a right to dominate both other humans and non-human life. And Jefferson Cowie has, in his recent history, Freedom's Dominion, written probably one of the best books, exploring the extent to which that right to dominate emanates from freedom's cry and freedom's claim. These other ways of imagining the grounding or soul of our freedom also involve conceits about our human independence of our psychic, social, historical, and cultural embeddedness, our physical independence of one another and of nature. In other words, this freedom based in imagined attributes, will or reason or morality, imagines freedom as an individual holding that snaps rather than avows our interdependence with both human and non-human life. And yet, the individualism within this supremacism also does something strange to liberal freedom. It produces a certain paradox in which, for all the high moral and intellectual conceits about what makes humans alone free, liberal discourses of freedom also figure us as kind of teeth-bearing creatures of the natural world, where we are on or off leash, caged or uncaged, commanded or running free, barely domesticated animals. For all the preoccupation, in other words, with moral autonomy and rationality and dignity and will, for all the Lockean and Leibnizian and Kantian absorption with the distinctive qualities of personhood that make only the few eligible for rights that bear our freedom, liberal freedom, and even more neoliberal freedom, is neither drawn from nor pertinent to our specifically human qualities, what I've called freedom seen, where we generate powers together. Rather, it's an image, and a notably poor one, of animal freedom. We're yelping dogs on long leashes, constantly longing to either lengthen the leash or break it. This peculiar form of humanism is one that's simultaneously, in other words, lost to its interiority and at the same time rampantly antisocial, anti-ecological, and anti-political. And it breeds a freedom profoundly alienated from all that sustains us and all that we instrumentalize and damage. This is what must be transformed. And I'll note in advance that Eva's going to give you a much deeper account of this dimension of liberal freedom. Okay, let me turn finally then to the transformation. Reparative democracy is the name I've provisionally given to a nascent successor form of democracy, an alternative to the neo-fascist emergence from the exhaustion of liberal democracy, and to the freedom that it promises. This successor form is oriented by the enduring damages to both human and non-human life that have accrued from capitalism, from colonialism, and from liberalism, all powered by fossil fuels. And it's spurred by the crises that are now erupting at the site of these damages. Reparative democracy aims at remaking democracy's golden promise, that we rule ourselves together in order not to be ruled by one or a part, the rich, the wise, the dynastic, the expert, or not to be ruled by impersonal forces, markets, technology, churches, bureaucracies. Reparative democracy also aims at remaking democracy's golden promise that we are political equals, that we share power and experience political freedom only to the extent that we engage in rule together. Reparative democracy breaks with liberal, social, and even radical democratic temporalities, ways of relating past to future. It breaks with liberal, social, and radical ontologies, ways of figuring and relating human and non-human. And it breaks with liberal, social, and radical democratic spatialities, understandings of where democracy resides and matters. It departs these other forms by replacing modernist binaries, human, non-human, past, future, individual, common, culture, nature, political and economic, with imbrication and connection between these terms, not just inverting them, but imbricating them, drawing them back together from their sutured existence. The we of reparative democracy is also novel and challenging. It too features imbrication of human and non-human life. Its venues are less and more than national, and its institutions and practices are not strictly state-oriented, though it can't at this point dispense with the state. The orientation to repair emanates from past political and economic forms that have damaged in continuously lively ways both the topography and the geography of the planet. And again, by continuously lively, I mean that because these damages now linger in agentic and consequential ways, we can't just overleap them. We can only reckon and work with them. We can try to renew thriving life at their sites. This is the work of reparative democrats. Okay, so what of freedom in reparative democracy? What's needed to build reparative democracy, which must enfranchise non-human life as well as all human lives, is a more rather than less distinctly human practice of freedom. And I'll explain that. What's needed is a practice of human freedom that builds from the complex scene of freedom that we've been considering, social powers, historical effects, political powers that address and redress these. And this kind of political freedom comprises both our species-specific powers and our connectedness with all life, human and non-human. Put differently, a democratic freedom compatible with repair and regenesis takes shape from our disavowed powers and disavowed interdependence with all life. It's embedded within, not taking flight from, what humans do. To the histories we make, the damages and agencies these histories produce, and our political capacity to address them and make different futures. I've suggested this is paradoxically a more intense human form of freedom than we've practiced before because it comes closer to what I've been insisting is freedom's distinctly human scene. And because it's more material in its relation to power than even Marx could achieve with the focus on production. Its materialism includes residuals and also powers of rule that Marx neglected, expressing what Bruno Latour called materialism at last. Equally paradoxically, this more intensely human form of freedom is all that permits us to enfranchise the non-human in reparative democracy. Of course, our interdependence with all life requires this enfranchisement, and in avowing that interdependence, builds our potential capacity to hear non-humans speak, to see them act. And this alone is what allows us to register their specific needs for thriving. This is very different from the eco-democracy trope today of trying to get humans to be more animal-like or tree-like. It's different from a cousin to that eco-democratic trope, rarefying and reifying indigeneity as a model for ecological cohabitation, when that model was so long isolated from world history, now only to be brought back in to rescue us. It's also at odds with extending rights to nature, which extends to nature the flawed liberal freedom that we've been charting. Liberalism's figure of itself, of the human, and the human's other. Rights of nature neither addresses the power within these rights have been conferred and are meant to navigate, nor does it address the problematic individualism and what Eva has rightly named propertization at the heart of rights discourse. Indeed, rights of nature tends to consecrate all three of these problematics, the powers, the individualism, and the propertization, and it leaves nature as helpless to defend against them as we are. All this said, becoming more human, practicing a more human freedom, does not mean retaining the non-human as our capital O other. It does not recommit to anthropectomy, where nature is our opposite. Rather, it features our distinctiveness within nature, along with our interdependence as creatures of nature, just as we understand the distinctiveness and the interdependence of honeybees or giraffes or sycamore trees or redwoods. We don't make them all the same. As Bruno Latour put it, Gaia, his name for the Earth system derived from earth scientists, Gaia is not one, but there's only one Gaia. That is, there's only one Earth system, but it's not unified. It contains differences, not identities and identifications or sameness. It's dynamic, constantly altering and adjusting, not static. Avowal of interdependence also means learning to practice political freedom, the rule of the people, in a partial and humble fashion. That is, in ways that understand we humans cannot rule over all and must be alert and open to the agencies of the non-human and the need for thriving in the non-human world. This more intensely human form of political freedom means also that regenesis replaces interest as the central precept of democratic life or political freedom. Regenesis includes repair, of course. We have no choice at this point in planetary history, but to remediate the damages of our historical estrangement from nature, our historically misbegotten freedom. We have to clean up. We have to contain what we can of what we've unleashed. But this does not mean hanging our collective heads, which is never the pose of freedom. Humans alone created the powers, the forms, and the practices that have brought planetary life to the brink, and humans alone can furnish alternative powers, forms, and practices. If we now grasp that we must inhabit the planet differently, with rather than atop nature, regenerating rather than exploiting and extracting, imbricated rather than individuated, of nature rather than apart from it. This also entails becoming more collectively powerful, intentional, willful, and future-oriented than our species has ever been, especially when exercising freedom. To become a responsible and remediating species, one alert to our powers in contouring the present and their residuals in conditioning the future, and to live differently in and as part of nature. The task is not to become less human and less free, but differently so, to become human finally and free at last. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for this wonderful talk. Our next speaker is Eva von Redecker, who is a public intellectual, critical theorist, and feminist philosopher, writing about social change, moral judgment, modern property, and of course, freedom. Her most recent books include Bleibefreiheit, Freedom to Stay, which is currently being translated into English, and Revolution for Life, which is available in Czech translation in the bookshops all around Prague. Let's give Eva a warm welcome.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here and have the freedom to listen to Wendy. And I thank the whole team at ZTP and Ivona for making it possible. It's really exciting. And I'm also looking forward to discussing with you later, some of you also tomorrow. So I think the fact that Wendy explains so convincingly that what freedom really is our collective agency and capacity to control, partly kind of rein in the forces that we ourselves have unleashed, only sort of sharpens the paradox of why it is somehow so weird what's happening with freedom at the moment. Because if this is freedom, then in actual political discourse, what it's kind of stopped or undermined with is not other values like, you know, order or maybe security or prosperity or whatever might be endangered by us collectively facing and addressing, abetting perhaps even for the climate crisis, but it is freedom itself. So this kind of collective freedom is sort of stopped or derailed by political reference to freedom. And I think I want to like motivate the way that I will speak about freedom here, which part of it it's quite abstract, with both the political horror and the political heartbreak. So the political horror that I'm sure many of you observe also is the fact, it's a bit what I just said, that freedom has actually become a really well-functioning, mobilizing value for the far right, for authoritarian and neo-fascist politics. And I will try to make sense of why this could happen in a bit, and I will definitely overgeneralize I mean, I guess, I'm a philosopher, it's my job. But there is something really striking that in so many different global locations, in post-socialist societies, in post-colonial societies, in long-standing liberal capitalist societies, sort of more or less the same reference or the same use slogans around freedom function to bring together very disparate interests and angers. So I think there is something sort of very general going on. So that's the horror, that freedom has become a fascist value. And here's the heartbreak. I think it's not just the kind of worst of our enemies who use that. So I think for me, it was mostly felt in the COVID crisis, where one could, or like a lot of us did, give very impeccable accounts of how, for instance, to control this dynamic of the pandemic and all the infections, we needed to do certain things collectively to kind of control the spread, for instance. But then there were people, and not just of the far right, but, comrades, Italian anarchists, French feminists, people we live with, who were like, no way, you're just fooling me. You're trying to tell me this is freedom. No, it feels like the utter loss of freedom to me, and I'm not having it. I insist on my individual freedom. So, and I think there is something. It is, of course, somewhat, or it is irrational, but there is something true about the concept of freedom in this insistence that at some point it has to also feel like freedom. So you can't have a kind of real freedom that nobody experiences as freedom. Like, there is something weird about that. And so therefore, what I'm going to do at greater detail is to speak about, as it were, I don't like to call it the individual, I would want to say the subjective side of freedom. Like, not so much as Wendy just did, freedom as a practice, but more like freedom as an experience. Like, how do we need to talk about freedom, or what needs to be the associations of the paradigm of freedom, so that in this collective taking responsibility, we can actually also feel our freedom and desire it and recognize it. Like, I think something quite profound about freedom's semantics has to change. And it's not just that it has to not be so individual anymore. I think it also has to be individual in a different way. So that's a bit the kind of frame of what I'm trying to present to you. So why is it that freedom is such a kind of useless tool, or such a counterproductive tool? What is kind of the wrong type of individual freedom? I do think it's our standard and prized notion of liberal freedom, like what our societies and constitutions are built on. And I mean, this is like, for the philosophers, it's like so boring. You have somebody somewhat partly educated by the Frankfurt School, and then they come and criticize individual negative liberty. I mean, that's what we all do. But I think there is something particular that maybe we need to still fully grasp about what liberal freedom is like at this moment in history, where I think it's not just sort of deficient, or it's not just egotistic, but it turns really rampantly destructive. And also, I think we're in a stage where you don't need to criticize it anymore, because it's breaking apart in front of our eyes. And it's breaking apart into two components that are actually kind of much worse than the original formula. Like, there's something about liberal freedom that is really ending, not because we criticize it, but because sort of it's coming apart in the world. And that gives us two parts that are unhinged and partly destructive. So what do I mean? What is liberal freedom? The kind of standard formula is already made up of two components. One component is precisely the individual right to do whatever I please in a certain domain that does not encroach on the freedom of the other. So you always have this sort of volition, do what you want, nobody can mess with you, don't even need to justify it. And then you have the limit. It's like, obviously you cannot destroy the equal freedom of the other, because then it's kind of hell breaks loose, state of nature, brutish, short life. So those two parts together order our liberal societies. And I think what we experience at present is that they kind of come apart. You have both of them separately. So you have, on the one side, this entitlement to do what you want, which is derived sort of from the early contract theorists on, from our ownership of ourselves. Because I own myself, I can act like an owner in the realms that are mine, so that are not treading on somebody else's terrain. So this kind of entitlement to dispose and do what you please and kind of own and even dominate, abuse even, that is something that in some political context seems to be the only thing that is meant by freedom. So dominion without restraint. Sort of, you can get it sometimes in the debates about, freedom of speech. People only seem to call free speech the speech that hurts somebody. Like, only then do they notice that it's free. Or I think there's also something like that going on with environment, where like you're only there is a freedom in driving an SUV, the sales of which, as you all know, are going like up at the moment, because kind of it will be over soon and it is destructive, and therefore there is a certain freedom in it. So that is and same with the COVID case, right? Suddenly your breath is only free if it can infect somebody else. Like, that's what makes it feel free. So there is a kind of possessiveness that loses out of sight the limit that would be the freedom of the other. And then on the other hand, you have more sensible people, liberals, progressive liberals, that say, no, this is like you've overlooked the crucial part. Not only should you respect the boundary, we are also learning from history how many boundaries have always been trampled on and how many things are actually at the moment adjudicated very unfairly. So we need to redraw certain limits. We need to give up some entitlements. That's the only way to have a good balance between those spheres of freedom. And if you do that properly, then often talking of freedom kind of disappears silently. Like, it gets dropped out of the equation. Somehow you have more of an appeal to responsibility or to respect, equality, non-discrimination, all those values, but it's somehow not even very much uttered anymore in the name of freedom. So you have those two broken pieces. One scene that I think illustrates it very well is the particular type of environmental activism where activists from last generation or Extinction Rebellion glue themselves to the street. Then you have, on the one hand, this kind of entitlement of, I want to be able to move. And on the other hand, you have those people that are just a kind of block in the way. They just stop the others in their attempt to, use their entitlement. And this scene, I think, it's not a coincidence that it is a scene of movement versus barrier. We had the volition, which is like, I can go wherever I want with my will, and then you have the, oh no, there's a limit. It's kind of a block in the road. And that's what this liberal notion of freedom does in a way. It makes us see every other only as a block. That's, of course, already kind of Marx's critique of it. And one aspect that I find so interesting is that it happens that way because if you look at it from this bird's eye perspective, from this kind of spatial of whose sphere is where, you actually only look at one moment. It's a timeless concept of freedom. It's like my sphere where I can move my mobility, and you're sitting there on the road. And then if you just look at it like that, of course, yeah, it's in the way. Like, those people are against freedom, the person who wants to speed there for freedom. But it's actually very weird that we just look at this one moment. So what I will kind of talk you through or try to suggest is that maybe one could describe this side that is just a kind of block very differently. Not as something that insists just on limits and barriers, but as something that actually measures the freedom in a completely different sort of dimension than the other end. Not in the dimension of how much entitlement to move do I have, but in the dimension of, wow, will we have time to even breathe in the future? Will there still be a road that one can use? What will transport be? So if you extend the kind of period over which you measure this freedom, you get a very different picture of who's blocking and who's opening or allowing for movement. And thinking about that got me to test out whether we couldn't say that freedom is already going wrong when it is seen in this geometric, very spatial terms. it's a good trick, when you say that, people don't already suspect you to be like a very weird lefty who wants to convince them of something. It's kind of, abstract enough to be, yes, why is freedom always just spatial? What would it be if we think about freedom temporally? And I think that's a move we need to make in order to come up with a different notion of freedom, even individual freedom, that is not so much in conflict, both with collective agency and with nature and environmental kind of responsibility or co-stewardship of resources. I call this the freedom to stay, which still, if you look at it in the first moment instance, is just this like, oh, I want to stay on the road, I blocked this, it's kind of the limit in space. But the freedom to stay, of course, also is like, it sort of revolves into a different perspective, which is, for you to stay, something has to go on. It's actually quite a lot of presupposition need to be there just for somebody to be able to stay. Like, there still needs to be a world. You need to be fed. Somebody mustn't run you over. Like, lots of the kind of conditions for sustained life suddenly are inside freedom. If you only do this operation of be like, there should be also freedom to stay, not just freedom to move. And if you think about freedom to move, which of course is very important, especially to progressive politics with the freedom of movement across borders, even freedom of movement only makes sense if you can also stay somewhere. I mean, if you migrate and you can never arrive, it's just continuous horror. Or if you have ethnic cleansing and people don't actually want to migrate, also the freedom to stay has to be in place for freedom of movement to make any sense. So that's kind of the first step of saying that even just the staying has something liberating or free in it. But I think, of course, staying alone or being allowed to live on, that's not yet freedom, right? I mean, that's life. I mean, that's a lot at a moment where life is endangered as much as kind of on as broad a spectrum as it hasn't been in human history, or perhaps even, sort of up to since the fifth mass extinction hasn't even been on a planetary level. But life as such is not yet freedom. So I think one needs to do something more with this idea of thinking of freedom primarily through time and through being allowed to stay, so that it actually becomes really an experience of freedom and not just an experience of, being around, being there, having some time. I mean, you can have horrible time, then it's not freedom. So what I try to do, therefore, is to give more of a sense of what quality time, or maybe better to say different temporalities, need to have to sort of turn life into freedom. What is free time? What is time that can be experienced as free time? And I give you, it's always suspicious to have lists of 3, it means they look too pretty. So, but I'll add another at the end this time. Okay, cool, that will save me. Three types of time, I think, are needed to grasp the specifically human experience of freedom. One of them, the third, I would say we share with almost all kind of life, almost all organic life, so which we also are. We are nature in one way, but I do also think there are 2 distinct experiences of freedom that in that form only humans have. So what are those? The first is still quite close to this literal understanding of the freedom to stay. It's almost coextensive with life. It's the linear time of our existence. And it is specific to humans that they actually know about that it's a time span and that it will end at some point. It's as if you say the first temporality of freedom is time thought on the model or template or mediated through the knowledge of death, because we know that it's a line, as it were, and it ends at some point on individual lives. And that's also a bit frustrating, of course, because then immediately you think about death, and it seems that the freedom to move and mobility is so much more inviting because, you can go all the way up to Mars or something. It's sort of, instead of being like, oh, damn, a few more decades. But I do think Wendy spoke so beautifully about the human condition. I mean, it is something about our human condition, so we can't just skip this. we have to also face this fact of finitude. And I think the way in which is pertinent or important for freedom is to see how incredibly unfairly measured the different lifespans of individuals are. I mean, of course, there can always be sort of accidents and early death, but we also live in a world where, in societies where different groups have very different expectancies of their lifespan. Where, I mean, that's Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses it to define racism, that it's the greater propensity of one group to the likelihood of premature death. And it's even more, or as strikingly true also for class relations. I mean, especially when it comes to men. I don't know the Czech figures. In Germany, it's 11 years. Like, working class men die 11 years earlier than bourgeois men. I mean, it's not just somehow unjust. I think it's a catastrophic loss of freedom that you have if your life is statistically that much shorter. So that's the first, is kind of the linear time. But that alone is not enough. The time also needs to somehow be good time, or kind of free time, vibrant time. And so the second thing that I want to stress as a specifically human access to experiencing freedom is freedom as spontaneity or initiative, like time that can be a beginning. This is very inspired by, many of you will know, the concept of Hannah Arendt's the natality. So if the linear time is thinking time through death, then the kind of initiative or initial time is thinking time through birth. Like, we also know that we're born. So, and Hannah Arendt says, and so we can also always begin again. Humans are beginnings, and they are beginners, as it were. So if we're free, and only if we're free, we have the potential, the capability to think of different options, and also to make new starts, as it were, to have a kind of self-rebirth. You know, that's part of what our agency allows for, that we can imagine alternatives and then also put them into reality. And if you look at it that way, with kind of adding potential beginnings, you don't have a line anymore. It's a very different model of time. It's like, I always think it's like a fan or something, you know, there are lots of lines or dotted lines because they're only potential lines, but it's suddenly a picture of time where the scarcity of the life that you count in days tips into something else, like something that is qualitatively rich. So that's why I would then call it fulfilled time. And I think also something of this infinity that you might yearn by going ever faster on the motorway, or ever further out into space, something of that infinity comes back into the way that we experience our lifetime. And I think this is not just an individual experience. It's a good way to think about group-based oppression, that they often function in that way, that certain groups don't, they're kind of structurally all the time tied in the way that they fill their time to the control of others. So then you have less initiative. There's no spontaneity because your living conditions have been rendered so bad. And of course, then if you don't even have the potential to make new beginnings, then this democratic freedom of collectively shaping your existence is sort of undercut, or at least it requires then a sort of resistant, for instance, something like a strike or a general strike even, that kind of enacts the collective agency in a way that it opens potentialities and possibilities. It's kind of a collective self-rebirth that wasn't there before. But of course, there's something that is also, I mean, I said at the beginning, it needs to also subjectively catch in order to be a concept of freedom. At our moment, in a way, the exhaustion and the burnout, both in society for humans, but also like throughout nature, is so rampant that a lot of people actually rather want like to have some proper sleep rather than get more spontaneity and initiative. And, you know, there's something sort of a bit free floating about appealing to this creativity. And I think that's also mirrored in the fact that talking about self-rebirth is a very self-contradictory term. I mean, nobody gives birth to themselves, right? There's always somebody else who does the actual work. So hopefully more than just one. I mean, that's already conditions of horror. There's just a mother. There are several people there. So we need to think about, as it were, the time of the world that gives us the resources for spontaneous agency, and also the resources to live our life in our lifetime, And those, I would say, when you said at one point, it's not that we make the planet. No, we don't make all of the planet, of course. Like those forces are also not of our own making. Some of them are, of course, human-made. Almost all of them are human-inflected or kind of shaped. But if you think of it more individually, they're there before us, and they have to kind of continue in their temporalities for us to be able to do pretty much anything. Like, you know, breathe, eat, drink. Lots of things have to be there to enable that. And we are quite well adapted to stay on this planet because we share the evolutionary history in its most, and you know, it's we're losing it right now, but the end of the Holocene was the most diverse that the planet ever was. So there was never so much different life and so many biological niches and so many biodiversity then in this time we're just destroying now. And my attempt to make ecology not be the kind of other to freedom or the limit, but rather something that enables us or allows us to experience freedom, is to also think it temporally. And I still don't know, I mean, maybe this is a trick, but I'm really still fond of it. So you'll have a hard time talking me out of it. I think if we want to be materialists about ecology, like given what we now know about the way that ecosystems function and even the Earth planetary system or Gaia, I think one good description is to say that the world is made up of time, but time of a particular type, time of a cyclical type, of sort of metabolic circles, like different stuff feeding into each other. There's nothing that is just like thinking of things like an inventory of all that is there is already very reified. That's not how sort of nature regenerates itself. Nature or different niches in it regenerate themselves in different time spans that it takes to restore lots of different things. You know, in a way, I don't know whether that works in English. In German, we always say alles hat seine Zeit, like there's time, like everything has its time. There is a characteristic time span that it takes to regenerate a certain creature. And of course, none of this regeneration would be possible if it wasn't kind of running through lots and lots of other cycles of other creatures. You know, I mean, without lots and lots of life in the soil, there isn't one plant growing in it. But what we are witnessing when we see degradation or even breakdown of ecosystems is the desyncing of those tides. So if you lose, it's almost like you lose one ring and then the others come apart, or something happens too early. It does happen. There are insects, but they're there so early that the birds don't have chicks yet, and then, you know, the bird population dies. So this kind of coming apart of certain tides that in the Holocene were somewhat stabilized and in a very self-regenerating way is, I think, the catastrophe of the Anthropocene, and something that drastically minimizes our freedom. Because if we have a harder time regenerating ourselves, or need to do more labor and also have less of a kind of, you know, choice or possibility, you can only grow potatoes because it's the only thing that sort of brings you enough calories, yes, as opposed to a very kind of abundant form of arable land that allows for many different ways of sustaining yourself. It's greater freedom. So this time of recovery or of regeneration, I think, is the third temporality that it takes to have freedom. And that's the one that we share with lots of other life and creatures. If you think of it as a sort of freedom to stay formula, then it's a somewhat redundant definition. It would be like the freedom to stay is an abundance of fulfilled time. So the long span, the abundance of the fulfilled time, that's the second time, in a time of abundance. So the richer the ecosystem is, the greater the freedom. And I think the fact that it is somewhat redundant that's the point, you know, you need kind of several layers in order to then allow for the greatest potential of human agency. And of course, we don't have that. And like we're losing some of that in the Anthropocene. But with this terminology, at least you can see that it's a loss of freedom, that not just losing the car or the non-speed limit is a loss of freedom, but losing certain species is a loss of our freedom, because it's our time. It's our, you can trace it back to our own regeneration at some point that we're losing. And so that's this kind of hope to have a notion of freedom that is not in contrast to ecology. And I think there is also a way of saying, so one way in which I also summarize it always is to say, oh, the freedom to stay means you can share time without losing it. That's the fulfilled time. And the regeneration time is that you can share time and thereby produce it. And of course, humans can also do that consciously. You know, that's reproduction, when you actually decide to repair something, when you decide to regenerate something. And I think our freedom in the future depends entirely on the fact whether we can find a way of being free in our contribution to regeneration. We'll never do, I mean, if we have to do all the work, then we're kind of done for, you know. But there will always be some bit that this planet does better than Mars. But then we have to kind of chip in. And humans can do that. They have a kind of unique capacity to also understand those connections. And if that labor, what Wendy calls repair, can be done voluntarily, uncoerced, spontaneous, then suddenly it's at the same time freedom and not just labor. That would be the sort of unalienated ecological labor equivalent to what is unalienated productive labor in Marx. And finally, that's my third and a half way of defining the time of the freedom to stay. Maybe one could say, if we managed to do what Wendy proposed, to be kind of collectively controlling, or at least facing and modifying the forces that we have produced, then one could say that we would have the freedom to stay with our own forces, with the things that we set into the world, as opposed to, you know, having to externalize it and pretend it's not there and it was never us, and it's, you know, it's force majeure, it's something, it's nature, or it's God, or it's something else, it's not us. Instead of saying, no, we can stay with it. And also we found a way of negotiating with it that does not destroy us. Like, we can actually stay on this somewhat warming planet. It doesn't warm all the way, and we can find a way to solidarically live here, for instance, by changing border regimes and agricultural practices and all that. So we have a freedom to stay with our human powers and our human forces, rather than taking the exit to Mars that is so characteristic of sort of contemporary, like that shows you where this kind of neo-fascist version of freedom as ultimate mobility leads to. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Eva. And thank you both for these very rich and thought-provoking talks. Perhaps I could start with a question about the diagnosis. And because I think you both diagnose the problem of freedom differently. So my question would be, what is the problem of our current concepts of freedom? And why do you think that they don't work anymore, particularly for the world of climate crisis? What do these received concepts enable, and what do they foreclose for what you want to achieve?
I think I want to be super brief and just say the liberal concept forecloses thinking beyond the present moment. It's a kind of time-blind concept of freedom. And that's already gets you in the mess. And then it gets kind of aggravated by this possessive destructiveness. Yeah, and I think diagnosis, there would be a lot more to say about the diagnosis. I didn't do that in the talk, why it's breaking now and why does it not hold together anymore. And like that's, for instance, like all the work Wendy did on neoliberalism, like this thing that the social fabric that is supposed to hold this liberal freedom together has like been worn out, cut, and now it's coming apart, and that's the problem.
I agree with Eva, and would just add that I think the other problem, if we're just to become really reductive about the liberal concept of freedom and relationship to the planet, is not only that it's presentist, but it's interest bound, and it's individually interest bound. And when you put those two together, you get the nightmare of our present.
But don't you think you need an additional, like, isn't some of what we're seeing right now even irrational in terms of self-interest?
No.
Okay.
I understand why you're saying that, but I think that you have to ask what the rationality of self-interest is. And it's not only a question about whether it's near term or medium term or long term, which I think is where your question is headed, but also it intermixes with the possibility of there being, as it were, solutions in the medium or long term. And I think that's how a lot of interest-bound liberalism, even apart from the breaking apart that you described so well, works. Like, it's okay. They will fix it. They will find a solution. And I think we do this at individual levels too. The drug Ozempic, it's a great solution, right? It solves the question of what you eat and how much you eat and when you eat and all the rest of it. If you like to eat a lot, now we have a drug that counteracts that.
I didn't even know that.
Oh,
Okay.
you didn't? Welcome to America. And
Well,
it is the largest selling drug in America suddenly. And it's off-label for this purpose, but that's what it is. It's the weight loss miracle. But let me be less hard on those Americans and just say, everybody who takes cholesterol-reducing drugs, who does not come by a cholesterol problem genetically, but simply by virtue of eating too many animal products, is in the same situation. It's like, oh, here's a fix. I don't have to solve it. So the interest that you're I'm going to the really weird and personal, but I'm suggesting that I think many people who say, oh, what the hell, I'll just, drive my car, blah. I know there's a climate problem. I think there's less climate denialism than we're sold. I think most people know there is a climate problem, and many, many, many people think it will be fixed, so I can still act according to my interest. And so I guess I'm less convinced that it's a deep contradiction.
So if I may, I wanted to maybe pose another question about the relationship of freedom to non-humans, because I think you both do a double gesture, which is slightly seems somewhat maybe almost paradoxical, and I would like to understand this closer. So on one hand, you say that freedom is a uniquely human feature, and it sounds a bit like human exceptionalism in the sense that the history of philosophy has been so good in marking the dividing line between humans and non-humans, so that, for instance, in contrast to animals, humans can speak, can reason, can feel, can have capacity to laugh, to mourn, and so on. And philosophy has been very keen on making those dividing line. And then there come ethologists and then saying, actually, no, animals can mourn, can laugh, can play, can communicate. And so they showed us that, it's a matter of a degree rather than a fundamental difference. And I was wondering about why is it so important for both of you to posit freedom as a uniquely human feature, and what does it allow you to do philosophically that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do? And what is the place of non-humans in your concepts of freedom?
Let me start this time. I don't think freedom is uniquely human. I think human freedom is uniquely human. And that distinction really matters. That is to say, our problem in being free is really different than the problem of the dog caged. The dog caged needs out of the cage. It could also be the dog, domesticated so severely that it's been made extremely neurotic, more like a human. That's a more gray area. But I think the reason I took such a long wind up to get to the problem of human freedom is that I do think this problem of generating powers by which we are then dominated, and often can't see the domination and then start coming up with rights to kind of navigate the powers and liberties to kind of smash at and blindly pretend the powers aren't there, that's the uniquely human thing. That is really different than other kinds of freedom in nature. I do think there's also politics in nature, just as you suggested, but it's different from human politics. But I do think it's there. If the species navigate and negotiate with one another, they have interspecies negotiations and navigations. Trees warn each other about fire and toxicity and bad air and droughts and all of the rest. We know all that now from all the wonderful work that we're learning from our science friends, but it's different from human politics. It's centered on different facets of being alive. It has different capacities. So I want to get over this divide. Are we like the rest of nature, or are we not like the rest of nature? Are we distinctive? And get through the humanist crap about that, which led us so down the wrong roads, and instead get to what is distinctly human about human freedom, while learning all the while from the freedom and the politics of non-human subjects. Yeah. I said I'd be brief, and I wasn't.
But you were so interesting. And also it helps me to be brief, because I agree with some of that. And I would say I actually have a notion of one aspect of freedom that I think is very general through the living world. But I don't think that that's animal freedom and then humans have a bit on top, exactly like Wendy just said. I'm not going to do this, but I spoke about human-animal freedom. I could give you, I think, a pretty complete account of what freedom would be for horses. I mean, it depends very much what type of horse. And then it already ends. Even for dogs, I think there would be only half I could do. So I think there's a lot that one then needs to know to do it for every species. And that, I think that brings me to wanting to ask you something back, Wendy, because so you only touched on it briefly now, but in your work on politics, sort of modeled on the way that listening happens also in nature or in ecosystems. And that there is a kind of, we are now sliding from freedom to politics, but that there is a politics of nature where interactions are happening that sort of gives signals of what should be done, where there is a need indicated, even some sort of concerted action. Mm-hmm. And do you think there is something, do you talk about listening because you think that is the prime democratic sense? Or is this the beginning and we're going to get from you the talk about seeing and the talk about smelling and the talk, because that, of course, then humans also do. We have those senses and then animals have other senses. And
yeah.
Octopus freedom has.
No, okay, so Eva's bringing in a whole other chunk of my work on reparative democracy and has been subjected several times to. I mentioned it briefly, but so I'm not going to answer you comprehensively because I don't want to go on, but I do think we can more aptly and thoroughly and learnedly activate our senses as part of our political world, as opposed to the deep suppression of sense and in the history of politics in the West, where it's all supposed to be rationality, it's all supposed to be speaking, not listening, it's all supposed to be deliberating and or simply exercising power. And I think for humans to become creatures who develop our senses will be part of enfranchising the non-human world more effectively. So it's not, I have my reasons for starting with listening and why that's so important. And it's partly because of the emphasis on speaking in the historical political tradition in the West and getting us to shush and listen instead, not only to one another, but to all of life. And partly because the sound studies field has taught us so much about how we can learn about thriving in the non-human world if we learn to listen and use assistive devices to listen. But I am going to move through the other sense.
But that does mean that you also have one aspect that moves across species that holds.
Yes, except different capacities in different species. I mean, a dog can live by its nose spectacularly. And, other creatures live by other kinds of antenna and senses. So, yeah, I don't want to assimilate us to to another creature in the world. I don't know if you have this here, but I'm so tired of the eco-democrats in my universe in the United States, carrying on about how we have to become more tree-like, more rhizomatic, more, I mean, there's all kinds of ways they want us to be more tree-like, and you're already shaking and cringing.
Oh, no, yes, because I have a bit of that. And
you want
revolution
us
for
to
that.
be more tree-like?
I think, yes, but we are the only, here's how I rescue it.
Okay.
We're the only species that can decide to be more like a tree. The tree can't. So wanting to be more tree-like is also part of human
But
freedom,
what's
not
the
just
virtue of becoming
more
more
the kind of
tree-like?
mycorrhiza, the kind of having all those solidaric exchange of the juices in the forest.
I see.
Sorry. let's move to the Ivana.
But we're not trees. We're this weird species, and we're not trees. So why should we try to become trees? And why should trees try to become us?
Everything is always, because we have fantasy and we always have models, images and like reference points and how we model our agency. So why shouldn't it be a tree?
Okay, we'll postpone this argument for now unless somebody wants to protract it. I have my reasons for why we shouldn't become trees. I think it's to escape human responsibility to become more tree-like.
I agree.
You worry about this too. Okay. I don't know if did we leave your question behind?
No, it's absolutely fine. I have actually another question, but maybe it's a bit also provocative, but and I hope you won't kind of gang up on me. But
you can't stand
you want us to become more tree-like.
No, I was wondering.
She's going to go for the moss and the grass.
No, it's kind of maybe it's a slightly different question. Why do you think it's so important to reclaim this solid term of freedom actually now? Because we can say, well, there are other terms like solidarity, for instance, that is from the get-go much more relational, and we can be much more connected and responsive to vulnerabilities or habitability or cohabitability, right? I was wondering, for you both, it's very important to rethink and reclaim and hold on to this concept. So I was wondering why it is so important, and I can imagine you have different reasons because you come from different intellectual traditions as well.
Well, I really think it's almost like a matter of truth. Like, I think we are free. Like, it's a misunderstanding to think we can escape it. And I mean, solidarity, just too many syllables, it's not going to cut. And the way that, like, I think both our ways of elaborating freedom have in them a certain version of solidarity also, like, because it is relational and it is a certain need or orientation also in the repair. But I think you really, like, I get this a lot also from the Extinction Rebellion people themselves. Like, they're like, if freedom is over, now it's survival. And I think it's deeply misunderstanding what survival as a human animal is. And I think it's always leads to the worst, to sort of anti-feminism, if you think that in matters of survival, there is no freedom, as if we don't choose how we feed, or like, if you breastfeed, hold the baby like this or like that, like there's a choice. So all our activities have a certain reflective dimension, and you can't say feed, like Hannah Arendt would, feed everyone and then you do freedom and politics. No, there is a certain freedom there. And of course, the way we've organized those is socially, then there's also a lot of unfreedom, but it's not about the nature of the reproductive work. You should all read the last chapter of Manhood and Politics. Wendy explains it much better there, how there is also freedom in those things if you don't split them off as object.
I think actually that Eva and I completely agree on why freedom is so important, and I'm just going to remind her of the other reasons that we agree on. So we agree on all of that, but we also agree that freedom is such a watchword now, in the past, in the future, that for the left to give up on freedom is to seal our fate. It's just over. If we were to turn against, we already turned against it enough for reasons that Eva's explained, through the splitting of it, through the long decades when we thought equality was a better value than freedom, identity within equality became more, we cannot give up on freedom. So that's a strategic reason. But then I also was trying to insist that only through freedom do humans become responsible for what we wrought. If we give up on it, if we give up on freedom in our account of freedom, we're giving up on our responsibility for what we are individually and collectively as power-generating creatures who have transformed the face of the planet and not made it. You're right, that was a misspeaking, but transformed it and done such devastation to humanity itself. And so freedom for me is an expression not of, individual liberation or emancipation against solidarity, but an expression of it that realizes maybe solidarity in a non-resistant mode, and in a mode that exceeds resistance and becomes power. And I think that's why I keep insisting on the relationship between freedom and power, that we must become creatures who own the power that we generate, who take responsibility for the power that we generate, and only then do we have a chance of making a future in which the aims of solidarity are realized rather than being kind of whimpering in the corner. I know that's hard on the solidarity people, but
I don't think we can own them, not the last round we've done. We can adopt them or face them or something. But now that the Anthropocene is happening, we're not going to control that fully.
Control
the powers that we've unleashed.
Oh,
like,
no,
we're
no.
not gonna, because you said we're going to own the powers, like own.
That's
avow.
Yeah. Okay. I meant avow,
I agree.
not own in a property sense. You're exactly right. I meant avow those powers and attempt to reckon with them, as opposed to, and I completely agree with you also that, we've unleashed so much, and I'm suggesting also unleashed agencies that are way beyond the possibility of human control. Plus, we don't own the planet. We're just a species on it.
And that's why also your account is not Marx 101, because it's not reappropriation, it's repair.
But we need that Marxist account of social power. We can't abandon it. That's why I'm always dragging all the thinkers along in a truck they don't want to be in together, but we need them all.
And we basically, solidarity in a very kind of proactive, also mutual aid direction wouldn't cut it even. Habitability.
I think your concept of mutualist co-articulation that you take from, I can never pronounce her name, Vinciane Després, I would say that is something that I try to get at. So that you're sort of becoming intelligent together, that you're making each other capable. I would try to tell that story via those sort of tides of sort of temporal feeding into each other and making each other, and I kind of like it because it's like, even of course tides is a metaphor also of a kind of coastal creature, but it's less metaphorical in that it points more to the material world that needs to be in place. And co-articulation, your critique of it is against representation, co-articulation, but there's still something that stays more on the level of signification, as it were. So that's why I think there is mutualism, but I want it to be a very metabolic materialist mutualism.
Can I ask Eva a question?
Sis?
When you said freedom has to feel like freedom, which I completely agree. You can't run tricks on people. And Rousseau's always accused of that. I think it's wrong reading of Rousseau, but he's always accused of that. He made this thing that was actually totalitarianism look like freedom, but it's not. But there are lots of ways of trying to trick people about freedom. But feeling like freedom is a historical problem. If you say to a really card-carrying libertarian anything that you and I just said, they're going to say that doesn't feel like freedom. But if you form them differently, if you culture, if it's a different historical production of life and work and relationship to nature and relationship to one another, freedom will feel different. So I'm wondering what you have in mind in that sentence, that freedom has to feel like freedom.
So ideology exists, and the formation we have and is even rational in the practices we're in. If their destruction is going on unabated, then it also makes sense to be like, okay, I want some share in the destruction. And then I don't think that I can talk someone out of that. No. I do say, I mean, that's now what's my theory of revolution, right? I just want to say, with this account, in a way, I want to do nothing more. I came up with it in a very particular moment 2 years ago when I felt if those people who glue themselves to the street, if they just have the resources to say back to the people, to the papers that write, those are terrorists who are against freedom, to say, no, hang on, we're in favor of freedom. It's just a different freedom. That's all, like, it's not even to convince the enemies. It's just to give their own team one more move to make. But I think the convincing the other side, besides the trick of starting very abstract and confusing them that way, which there's something that's surprising how far one sometimes gets with that, is that I think no libertarian leads a fully libertarian life, right? True. There will be some practices, and then you somehow have to be like, how can we validate and make that more paradigmatic than the other experience? But I have no theory of how we're going to win this.
I understand that, but I'm trying to not talk so much about reasons or even ideology as the subjective experience of being free that is itself historically produced in very specific ways.
Yes, and then that's why one needs a sort of genealogy of all the possessiveness in the liberal freedom and how it produced those subjects. But I think in a way that there's nothing better I can come up with than giving, as it were, a genealogical critique of it that makes it look less normal and less like beautiful, just like freedom, but actually, oh no, it's unhinged possessiveness that was never granted to all. Do you still like it? Does it still feel like freedom? Sort of, but I don't think that it's not gonna fully cut it. Okay. But you have the same problem with people not feeling free, and everybody hates to be in a plenum, even though it makes...
No, that's why I'm asking you to answer my problem. Go ahead.
Yes, and maybe a final question from my part before we give the floor to the audience. I was wondering, what would this new understanding of freedom mean for politics, for political practices, for democracy? So introducing the temporal turn to freedom, or having listening as part of the reparative democracy. What would it mean actually for our political organizing for democracy in practice?
Well, I think it would completely, and I think that's also something that I'm curious about how Wendy addresses that. It would completely also change the way we think about the demos as one, in the worst case, even sort of thought of homogeneous and ethno-national collective deciding now what to do. I think if we were less, like, I somehow have this idea if one was less time blind and understood that different things have very different temporalities depending on what substances they are or what life forms they are, you could kind of sketch again those things that in 1918 to 20 we had those beautiful drafts of how council democracy would function, and there it was kind of, it was still sophisticated, but it was very sensible. They thought they could keep running the division of labor and the economy as it was, and then you have, like, the textile workers and the so-and-so workers and blah, and you have a kind of there is a pre-organization of society, and then on top of that you have your democratic negotiations. And I think we completely lack that, such a sort of construction plan at the moment, and the national demos they're not the ones who suffer, like, they don't suffer the consequences often, or they don't even in one country have the power to address some of those problems. So I do think that there could be something like, the Ocean Council and the Recycling Council, and all of them also operating on kind of different timescales. And some things have to be decided very quickly. Some things you can go to the assembly if you're in Prague for just 2 days. You can go to the assembly that decides should this weed in one of the stations be cut that will soon go to seeds or not. And then if I can do it tomorrow afternoon. And other things is like, what do we do with the historical monuments that have been there for hundreds of years and it takes long repair? Like, that other people should decide that, maybe, because they're the constituency that is affected by it and that sort of stays with the problem, as it were. Like, yeah, sorry, I stop.
No, that's great. I'll just offer one example. So Right now, I'm just going to take us to the United States for a second. 1/3 of the land in the United States is called public land. It's protected. It's either state forests or otherwise contained and protected land. And one of the things our current administration is planning to do is privatize all this land and sell it off. And one of the things that I think listening can do is very different from what we learned from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That was an enormously important book. It inaugurated a whole ecological consciousness that was really important more than half a century ago. But it was all about silence. By contrast, I want to suggest that listening can offer us the contrast between what one hears on these public lands, which is all kinds of things that humans can be trained to listen to even more profoundly than they do, not just the sounds of chirping birds or rustling leaves, but all kinds of sounds of interdependent life. And to contrast that with what we can do now with all kinds of technologies, with what is planned for those lands, which is the clanging and banging of oil wells, the building of basically toxic industries that no city wants nearby, the building of it's a vision of a new America with a new set of factories. I actually think you can win over a lot more human beings to ecological safeguarding and preservation through exposing them to those contrasting sounds, to listening, to hearing, to taking in what it means to destroy life and replace it with stuff that we basically don't need or worse than not need. I actually think there's profound potential there beyond argumentation, beyond giving reasons, beyond yelling around about preserving nature versus, new jobs and the rest of it. So I actually think that humans, that there are ways in and ways under current political divides through the mobilization of sense and a political freedom that is rooted in a people's will, as opposed to reasons, speaking, rationality, and the rest of it.
Thank you. So I will now open the floor to questions. Who would like to pose the first question? Yeah, John? Yes, yes. Give it 10 seconds.
Okay, great. I usually cough into these things and bust everyone's eardrums, so I'll do my best. So thanks a lot. This has been super fun and interesting. So my background is in philosophy of cognitive science and AI, so I'm a complete stranger to these dialogues. But like any philosopher, I take freedom seriously and take autonomy seriously. And I think about like Richard Horton, and I think about like, who else comes to mind here? Maybe different sources than you're used to sort of citing or reading, like Harry Frankfurt. I think about like the phenomenology of...
I think we're used to teaching him as well.
Yeah. I think about like the phenomenology of freedom that's sort of talked about, like the feeling of effort and like how important that is. Like being free is difficult. Like, and they often use the sort of like metaphor, but not so much the metaphor of an addict who's struggling to overcome their addiction and to regain their freedom, right? And I'm thinking about the reparative aspect of what you're talking about, Wendy, how like there's a way in which our freedom is sick today, like it's sort of toxified, and we need to sort of detoxify it in the way that an addict might need to recover from addiction. And I'm sort of thinking about all of this, and it's sort of kind of making sense with what you all are saying. So I don't really have so much a question as I do as sort of a comment on everything that you all have been talking about in a way that trying to translate all these insights into how the neoliberal notion of freedom, which has a kind of metaphor of like a child needing to outsmart a parent and the parent being like a state actor or whatever it may be, and like moving to like more of the, we're in this toxic environment, we're terribly addicted to whatever the things that we're addicted to, and we need to recover from that addiction and realize things that we've lost, right? The freedom that we've lost. And maybe that metaphor was a powerful one enough to translate these very complex philosophical insights into like actionable effects that, you know, the average people, voters, can make sense of and do something with. Yeah, because I'm always just, you know, how can we turn this into like, you know, how can we win that debate, you know, that we're sort of right now struggling to win in ways that are really impacting the world and ways that we would like to stop immediately and reverse course on. So anyway, that's what I have to say. Sort of my comment, and I'd love to hear what you think about all of that. Thank you.
So I think, of course, one can now try to kind of bounce it back and forth with all sorts of accounts, and I guess I made myself responsible for doing that by talking so generically about liberal freedom, right? And I think it's still possible to say that Harry Frankfurt's notion, which is definitely an individualistic notion, also has this, well, as I would call it, spatial imaginary, in some sense almost like really spelled out, because he has this architecture of sort of first and second order desires. But he has no notion of the fact of what powers shape my second order desires. And I think that's what sort of we are both, like the tradition we both come from is really interested in. Like, what are the collective, so I wouldn't want to win it over by telling a Frankfurtian to have different second order desires, but by asking what world do we need to bring about? And part of the world is like what concepts float around in the world, so that suddenly like the formation of other second, less alienated, less individualistic second order desires becomes possible. So, and that's where I think it's kind of also there is a kind of creative part where philosophy can say, oh, here's a concept that either we've neglected or that wasn't even there before, and that allows to do some of the work. It's a very weak tool. I don't think so, because you say, what can we do to win people over? I think linguistic creation and argumentation is not the biggest thing, but it would be ridiculous as a philosopher to just sit there and be like, oh, what we actually should do is form a mass movement. And like, you know, that's a different room in which one says that.
I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna pick up a little piece of what you said about the addiction and what is being craved right now. I mean, I think Eva offered a beautiful diagnosis of the splitting of liberal freedom into the freedom and its limit, right and left, and the right essentially taking freedom rogue by taking its limit off. And yet, I'm reminded of John Stuart Mill, who, even in his extraordinary paean to individual liberty, not only acknowledged that it's very hard to figure out where the harm is that one does to another with one's own freedom, which is always supposed to be the limit of freedom, but also acknowledged quietly in that second chapter that we all want freedom, but we really don't want others to have it. And I think the right is actually in that pickle. And when people say, oh, they're hypocritical, they say they want freedom, but actually they want tremendous authority to produce and enforce the patriarchal family and white supremacy and Christianity and ethno-nationalism. I don't actually think that's a contradiction in liberal freedom. And I'm thinking about your argument about addiction and toxicity. I actually think they are expressing that Millian predicament beautifully, which is we want freedom, and we want freedom to be for these things, these particular objects. You could call that an addiction or just a political and cultural attachment. And therefore, we don't want anyone else to have the freedom to say no to those things. And I think that is still within the rubric of, yes, fractured liberal freedom, but I think it's still within the rubric of it, as even Locke, in his understanding of what propertization of freedom produces, that it's necessarily going to produce the propertyless, and he gave a whole rationale for why that was okay. And Mill takes to another step by just saying, we just need to reckon with this. It's the same thing that we now call a tolerance problem. That we want our freedom, but we really don't want the freedom of those we can't stand, or the freedom of those whose wants we can't stand. And I think the way that both Eva and I are trying to take freedom out of that individual predilection and attachment and toward something that's more social and ecological attempts to break that bind. I don't think it can do it through a philosophical trick. I think it has to do it through a material set of relations, producing an imminent need for that. That's another chapter. That's another talk.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you both, and thank you, Ivana. Thank you, everyone. I have just wanted to ask you a fairly straightforward question to both of you, really, about how you think about the state in relation to both projects, whether as a kind of an enabler of freedom, an enemy of freedom, an enabler of the public, and perhaps not just the state as it is, but also the state as it could possibly be. So sort of, could we imagine a state that listens, or a state that is in touch with the tides in a certain way? And if we can imagine that, is that really still the state? Is it worth hanging on to that language, or is it worth thinking beyond that kind of language? So really, yeah, that's just a very open question about both about that.
Okay. My thinking has really swung here lately. So you're offering me a chance to be very vulnerable as an intellectual. To start with where it swung from, I've long believed that political freedom, understood as real democracy, is inherently anti-statist, which doesn't mean that there's no place for the state, but we have to understand the state as the attenuation or the halting, the kind of conclusion of the moment of political freedom, expressed as here's what we want to do. And yet it enacts the possibility of that coming from the people. But the state as an institution, I've long thought, can't do it. And then here's what swung my thinking: watching Trump, but also Orban, and also Starmer, and also a series of other, Modi and Erdogan, watching their transformative state projects has reminded me that the left better get on board with that we cannot afford to cede the state as a site of enacting a political vision. That's different than the continuous administrative state and all the attenuations that it achieves with regard to political freedom, but it is a separate question. It's a question of how do we bring our political vision, our political project into being. It's not the same as freedom, but it is an enactment of something that I think we better get smarter about. So I sent off a broadside on this topic in Critical Times blog. Is that what it's called? Yeah, something like that, a few days ago, that you could look up, in which I really insisted that the left has to start thinking hard about transformative, what the state can be as a transformative politics, as opposed to a constitutionalized liberal, essentially static or stasis kind of politics. But I do think there's an interval between that and what I'm talking about as freedom. Okay, your turn.
Yeah, I think it's more interesting if I really argue the opposite now, because I also do think that we that's a different event where we argue about that piece of yours, because I think there is too much of a, we cannot do the same thing that they're doing just because it's successful for them right now, and only to sort of, so you're suggesting because they use state power for so much transformative politics, we also need to use that side. And then there's, I think, another part of the left which is more like, oh, now that neoliberalism and also sort of Elon Musk or, well, still neoliberalism are destroying the state, then now we love it. And I think that's not enough of a political horizon. And I think one could always argue, well, they can only do that because we have those bloody centralized nation states with which you can take over the apparatus. So I actually really love though I usually hate everyone who calls themselves a Leninist, and I would never do that. The early Lenin of State and Revolution, which is of course the opposite of what then happened later, has this very interesting way of talking about, I mean, there's all this grand gesture of destroying the state, but what it's really about is transforming the state on the model of the commune form. And the commune form is not the tired distinction between decentralized sort of kind of anarchist primitivists and their little villages or centralized modern state power monsters. But it's an idea of distributed power where kind of very, very different kind of reaches and infrastructures of self-administered rule, self-determination kind of are coordinated in a certain way. And this distributed model of, like, that's also the shape of the early internet, for instance, you know, that I think is very interesting. And I have no idea what it would mean to reform a state on that model, but that is, if you ask me for what's the horizon, that would be how I would try to reply to it. And I also think that right now it's maybe there's so much sovereign power accumulated elsewhere than in the States. I mean, that's why, part of why Trump can do what he do is because he has the tech giants on board. But a lot of the administration cannot happen without Palantir, for instance. So I think what we really need to do is kind of, as non-Leninist, neo-Leninists, is to destroy also those monopolies and distribute those as well.
So I just want to say, I completely agree with you in the longer vision, but I want to figure out how to use the state to get there. And I don't think we do it on the model of the corruption and the terrorism and the authoritarianism that the new breed of authoritarians are using to handle the state. But I think we do it on our own model, and I don't think that can be instantly redistributive. I think that's to shoot our feet. I am looking for a neo-Leninism. The phrase I used was an anti-Leninism that's a Leninism that's anti-Leninist, and it needs to be expanded. But I think it's not just a question of they've evacuated the state and we should take it over. They haven't evacuated it. They've seized it for transformative purposes, and they've shown how fast you can move to transform a political economy, a political culture, a set of laws, and even a global order. Now, obviously, we're talking about the empire doing this, but and it can't just be done anywhere. But I think in the climate emergency, there's some kind of model there that we can't afford to completely ignore, even while ultimately my idea is very close to you, which is my idea ultimately of democracy from below that holds the feet of the state to the fire 24/7 to make sure it is doing what democracy from below requires and demands. It's a little bit Rousseauist, but not entirely. Do you want to say something? You can do it forever. But go ahead, argue back. Come on.
Well, yeah, I think, but isn't in some sense that's what's happening? There is a kind of popular majority that, for instance, wants ICE to do those deportations, and it's holding the state accountable to do that. Like, I do think it sometimes sounds in your telling as if, as soon as it's from below and collectively wanted, then it's also the politics we want to see. And so I do find it scary that there is this monopoly of power at all that works for our enemies. Because, I mean, it's also, I think, a bit of a difference between the United States and here. So in Germany in particular, the whole democracy, Republican notion of democracy and the collective control is completely like also like freedom taken over by the right wing. Like it's the AfD that wants more democracy and sort of more holding the state accountable to do what the people want. And of course, then that really is, again, the question, who's the demos, right? And you would solve that differently, and then you have a different...
I mean, I think the one other thing, I agree with you completely on that. I think the one other thing we need to add in is that what you mentioned earlier, all the sovereign powers that are not statist. And of course, the most important today is finance. And I mean, it runs states now. I mean, because states, through the neoliberal revolution, wiped out their own revenue base by cutting taxes and a bunch of other things. They now need to attract private finance, and private finance is what is calling the terms of the deal. And so the future is, if we continue on this road, is not just a question of states. It's really more importantly a question of capital. Whether it's one thing to say, oh, of course we abolish that, and the state too, but it's another thing to say, what do we do if a world in which capital endures is one we're trying to remake in a left direction? Okay, more questions.
So one last question, Alice?
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting dialogue and lectures. I wonder if you also see some ambivalence between your stress on reparation, repair, regenesis, regeneration, remake now, and yet transformation. So you speak about going forward and going in one way backwards. And when you speak about regeneration, about reparation, it might imply that something has broken, and we ask ourselves how to work with this rupture. That's one possibility. And we recognize through this rupture that we have lost maybe something that we were not aware. Like through this rupture, we understand we lost something, and how we regain this when we have lost it might be the transformative task, so to say. And it's both the task backwards and forwards. So the other possibility might be that nothing was broken, but we reached some state of double bind, if I use Gregory Bateson's claim, which you used at the very beginning. We are so free that the more free we are, the less free we are. So it's the double bind situation from which we must not, like, we don't return, but we repeat something, or we make another gesture. But we cannot stay within the double bind in order to change it. And once again, is it the gesture we need to do is to do something again in another way? Should we return somewhere in order to go forward? And how to combine these two tasks? Thank you. Maybe I have a very, very strong or I'm very motivated by the restorative justice. It's a very interesting concept that speaks about a situation when the crime was done and the law is only coming with justice. The perpetrator is punished, but what is not restored are the human relations. So the victim is still the victim when it comes to broken relation, or broken the relation to itself or to the world. And the question of restoration might be another concept that might be helpful in this discussion, or in this concept.
I think those are both, you put it in a very helpful way, and I completely agree with both the ambivalence of like going back to the past and there's something non-transformative and restoring something, but then also it's transformative to start restoring in the first place, and also the nuances between what the terms are that we use. Do we speak of repair, regeneration? Wendy also said regenesis, which is more grand. It's kind of, redoing the whole, there's more creativity in there. Or, you spoke of restoration. I actually want to maybe add one more term that I didn't say at all in the talk, which is readoption, like picking up the discarded bits. And that maybe brings me to, so I think when one starts deciding that the reparative attitude is the right one, or the restorative, or then of course the questions only start what to repair, right? I mean, the right also has a great reparative, they repair some past glory. I don't want to repair that. And so on the left, you need a sort of, there needs to be some materialist analysis of this way in which things are systematically broken to know where to start. And I think we actually both share an account of capitalism that is very interested in the kind of decapitations or the cuts that capitalism does, or capitalist modernity. And I mean, the way that I approach this, and I mean, that's in the Revolution for Life, is to say there are two very systematically recurring cuts. There is the cut to sort of cuts, my cookie cutter theory of capitalism. There's the cut that cuts out things as property and disservice them from all the kind of embeddedness that also is often needed to restore them. And then there's the cut of the commodity form that values one part and crucially devalues and nullifies another part. So you don't have production without discard. So Andreas Malm has worked this all out, including with a little new formula for capital for fossil fuel and for CO2 emissions. But I think that's actually generally true about capitalist production. There's always a sort of waste or like something ruined that you leave behind. Otherwise, the valuation couldn't happen. So if, for instance, you say that, so those are kind of structural cuts that keep happening again. And then that would give you a bit of a heuristic of where to start repairing, or what to restore, reclaim, where to kind of, which, in a way, with which life to start, with the most subjected, most privatized and precarious one. So sort of Black Lives Matter, not All Lives Matter, and also with what we need to tidy up, because it's of course floating in the atmosphere and breaking other tides. So that's in a way.
Okay, this will sound like a quibble, but it matters to thinking about the reparative. I don't think it's in any way equivalent to the restorative. You know, the climate change scientists and the extinction chain scientists and the rest of them keep reminding us that we're not going to restore Holocene diversity or balance. So what do we mean by the reparative if it's not restoration? And here's where I think we can get away from that right-wing dream of restoration. We mean, what I'm hoping we can mean is an orientation toward damage that we could contain or arrest from going further, toward the human ingenuity and creativity that can figure out how to help certain things thrive or survive that are at the brink of not doing so. And all kinds of features of nature have this possibility. I mean, there's these amazing things going on with coral reefs that are very close to coming to the end in many places on the Earth. And what oceanographers have discovered about the capacity to help them not recover and not be restored, but stay alive long enough for us to stop warming their environment to the degree that we are, helping them change the character of being a coral reef that leads to bleaching being such a disaster for them. So there's reparative work forward as opposed to restoration of a past. And so that's why I was struggling as you were speaking. You said, sounds like we're talking about going backward and forward. And I don't think the backward helps us. It also comes too close to a tendency in critical theory that worries about regression as opposed to progression. I think we have to put both of those aside and think closer to what Eva has introduced us to, which is thinking in temporalities that are not about progress and regress, but are about how to expand the possibilities of time for all species where it's closing in on them. And that is a reparative work that is a very concrete practice. Sometimes it's a very abstract picture, but it's finally a very concrete practice. And it's not the same as reparations, and it's not the same as restorative justice. Those things may be important I mean, they are important in a certain kind of justice project, but the reparative democracy that I'm trying to get at could comprise those justice projects, but isn't fundamentally centered there, as opposed to thinking about how to reorient democracy entirely toward the historical damage that contours a future that we either can begin to open out more robustly or live to its conclusion, its finitude, the finitude that Eva so beautifully reminded us human beings don't want for our own lives or our collective lives.
Thank you. I'm afraid this is all the time we have.
Okay, there was enough abundance in there.
Some abundance in your finitude.
So thank you very much to Eva for these wonderful talks and for this exchange. Thank you to the audience for coming, all your wonderful questions. Please join us for informal drinks outside, and let's thank Eva and Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks.